What happens when society's cruelest bullies target the wrong person? When laughter turns to screams and the hunted becomes the hunter? This is the extraordinary true story of Sarah Chen, a quiet young woman who endured years of relentless torture from her peers, only to discover a strength within herself that would hand an entire military base and earn the respect of 282 Navy SEALs. They thought they knew her limits. They were catastrophically wrong. Sometimes, the most dangerous weapon is the one nobody sees coming. Sometimes the prey has claws sharper than the predators ever imagined. And sometimes, justice comes not from the courts or the authorities, but from the hands of someone who simply refuses to break. This is that story. A story of transformation, revenge, and the moment when the underdog's bite proved far worse than their bark. Prepare yourself for a journey that will challenge everything you think you know about strength, resilience, and the price of pushing someone too far. Sarah Chen had always been different, but she never thought that being different would cost her everything she held dear. Standing barely 5'2" inches tall with delicate features that made her look younger than her 22 years, she possessed an intelligence that both intimidated and infuriated those around her. Her father, a decorated Marine Corps veteran, had instilled in her the values of discipline, respect, and quiet strength. Her mother, a brilliant engineer, had taught her that problems always had solutions if you were smart enough to find them.
Growing up in a small military town outside San Diego, Sarah had learned early that fitting in wasn't her strong suit.
While other girls her age were obsessing over makeup and boys, she was buried in martial arts manuals and computer programming books. Her father had insisted she learn self-defense from a young age, though he probably never imagined she would need those skills against her own peers. The trouble began when Sarah enrolled in the local community college's criminal justice program. She had dreams of joining law enforcement, maybe even working her way up to federal agencies. Her academic performance was flawless, consistently earning the highest grades in every class. But excellence, she discovered, could be a curse when it made others feel inadequate. Marcus Rodriguez and Jake Thompson were everything Sarah wasn't. Marcus, a former high school football star whose dreams of college scholarships had died with a knee injury, now spent his days lifting weights and nursing grudges. At 6'3" with arms like tree trunks, he commanded attention wherever he went. Jake, his loyal sidekick, was smaller but meaner, with the kind of cruel intelligence that found weakness like a heat-seeking missile. The first incident happened on a Tuesday morning in Professor Williams' constitutional law class. Sarah had just finished presenting her analysis of Fourth Amendment protections when Marcus's voice cut through the applause. "Must be nice having Daddy's military connections to help with your research," he said loudly enough for the entire class to hear. "Some of us actually have to work for our grades." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she kept her voice steady. "I don't use any connections. I research everything myself." "Sure you do, Princess?" Jake chimed in with a smirk. "Bet Daddy fights all your battles for you, too." From that moment on, Sarah became their primary target. What started as verbal harassment quickly escalated. They would arrive early to class just to take the seats around her, whispering cruel comments about her appearance, her family, her accent. When she tried to participate in class discussions, they would make exaggerated yawn sounds or pretend to fall asleep. During group projects, they would exclude her entirely, forcing her to work alone while spreading rumors that she was impossible to work with. "Sarah tried everything she could think of to make it stop." She spoke to Professor Williams, who offered sympathetic words but little action. She tried changing her schedule to avoid them, but they seemed to appear wherever she went.
She attempted to ignore them completely, hoping they would lose interest, but their behavior only became more aggressive. The psychological warfare was relentless.
They would follow her to her car after class, shouting insults about her driving. They found out where she worked part-time at a local bookstore and would show up to harass her there, pretending to browse while making loud, crude comments about her body. They discovered her social media accounts and began leaving devastating comments on every post, forcing her to delete her online presence entirely.
But it was the physical intimidation that truly terrified her.
Marcus would deliberately bump into her in hallways, sending her books flying while pretending it was an accident. Jake would position himself behind her in lines, breathing down her neck and making her skin crawl with whispered threats about what they wanted to do to her. They began timing their movements to corner her in empty hallways or parking lots, surrounding her while making increasingly violent threats. "One day, little princess, you're going to learn what happens to stuck-up bitches who think they're better than everyone else," Marcus had hissed during one particularly frightening encounter near the library. Sarah had pressed herself against the brick wall, heart hammering as Jake blocked her escape route. "Maybe we should teach her a lesson she won't forget. Jake had suggested, his eyes glittering with malice. Show her what real men can do to little girls who don't know their place. Sarah had somehow found the courage to dart between them and run, but their laughter had followed her all the way to her car. That night, she had called her father sobbing into the phone about wanting to quit school.
But Lieutenant Colonel Chen had not raised a quitter. "Sarah, remember what I taught you about bullies?" His gravelly voice had come through the phone like an anchor in a storm.
They prey on fear. The moment you show them you're not afraid, they lose their power. But Sarah was afraid. She was terrified. The harassment was affecting every aspect of her life. Her grades began to slip as she struggled to concentrate during classes. She lost weight from stress and lack of appetite. Sleep became elusive as she lay awake, replaying their threats and wondering if they would follow through. Her mother noticed the changes immediately. Dr. Plebe makes appearance. 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 Dr. Plebe makes appearance.
Ah!
Amy Chen had built her career on attention to detail, and she could see her daughter crumbling before her eyes. The vibrant, confident young woman who had left for college was being replaced by a hollow-eyed shadow who jumped at sudden sounds and avoided eye contact. "Baby, you need to report this to the administration," her mother had pleaded during one of their weekly phone calls. "This is harassment. It's illegal." But Sarah knew better. Marcus and Jake were careful. They never left witnesses to their worst behavior. They were smart enough to keep their harassment just subtle enough that authority figures would dismiss it as college drama or personality conflicts.
Sarah had tried reporting them once already, only to be told by the dean's office that interpersonal conflicts between students were not their responsibility unless actual violence occurred.
The breaking point came during finals week of her second semester.
Sarah had been studying in the library until closing time, trying to prepare for her criminal psychology exam. The parking lot was nearly empty when she finally made her way to her car, arms full of textbooks and her mind focused on case studies and statistical analysis. She didn't see them until it was too late. Marcus stepped out from behind a pickup truck while Jake emerged from the shadows near the building.
They had been waiting for her, planning this moment when she would be alone and vulnerable. Well, what do we have here? Marcus's voice was different now, darker and more dangerous than she had ever heard it.
"Little princess working late again?" Sarah's training kicked in. Her father had taught her to always be aware of her surroundings, to identify escape routes, to never let an attacker get too close. But she was trapped between her car and theirs, weighed down by textbooks, and there was nowhere to run. "Please," she said, hating how small her voice sounded. "I don't want any trouble. Just let me go home." Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it.
"Oh, you don't want trouble? That's funny, because you've been nothing but trouble since the day you walked into our class with your perfect grades and your daddy's hero stories." They began to circle her like predators, and Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with genuine fear. These weren't idle threats anymore.
Something had changed in their demeanor, something that made her skin crawl and her instincts scream danger.
"You think you're so smart," Marcus continued, his massive frame blocking out the streetlight.
"Think you're better than us, but you're just a scared little girl who's about to learn a very important lesson." Sarah dropped her textbooks, the sound of them hitting the pavement abnormally loud in the quiet night. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was suddenly crystal clear. This was it. This was the moment her father had prepared her for, the reason for all those hours in the dojo learning techniques she had never wanted to use.
I'm warning you,
she said, and this time her voice was steady. "Stay away from me." Their laughter filled the night air, cruel and confident. They thought they had her cornered. They thought they knew exactly who they were dealing with. They had no idea that cornered animals were the most dangerous of all. As Marcus reached for her, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She stopped running. She stopped hiding. She stopped being afraid. And in that moment of transformation, the hunted became the hunter. The first strike came faster than Marcus could process. One moment he was reaching for Sarah's shoulder, confident in his size advantage and her apparent helplessness, and the next moment he was doubled over, gasping for air as her elbow connected with his solar plexus with surgical precision. The sound that escaped his lips wasn't the confident laugh he had been expecting to make, but a strangled wheeze of complete surprise. Jake's reaction was equally swift but far less coordinated.
"What the hell?" he shouted, lunging forward to grab her from behind.
But Sarah had already pivoted, her father's training flowing through her muscle memory like water finding its course. Her heel found Jake's instep with devastating accuracy, followed immediately by her elbow driving backward into his ribs. The crack that followed was audible even over his scream. For the first time in months, Sarah felt something other than fear. The sensation was intoxicating, like stepping out of a dark room into blazing sunlight. Every technique her father had drilled into her, every principle he had taught her about leverage and timing and the weak points of the human body, suddenly made perfect sense. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a weapon that had finally been unsheathed. Marcus straightened up, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. "You little bitch," he snarled, raising his fist. "I'm going to break your pretty face." But Sarah was no longer the terrified girl who had dropped her textbooks moments earlier. As Marcus's haymaker came toward her head, with all his considerable strength behind it, she simply wasn't there anymore. She had slipped to the side with fluid grace, using his own momentum against him as she grabbed his extended arm and twisted it behind his back with a leverage technique that would have made her father proud. The sound Marcus made when his shoulder popped out of its socket was unlike anything Sarah had ever heard. It was raw and primal, the sound of someone experiencing pain beyond their comprehension. But instead of feeling sympathy, she felt only a cold satisfaction. This was justice. This was what they had earned through months of torment. Jake was back on his feet, but his movements were clumsy and desperate now. The confident predator was gone, replaced by a panicked animal realizing it had misjudged its prey catastrophically. He pulled a switchblade from his pocket, the metal gleaming under the parking lot lights. "You crazy psycho," he gasped. His breathing labored from his injured ribs. "I'm going to cut you up for that." Sarah felt a moment of genuine surprise at the weapon, but not fear. Her father had taught her about knife fighting too, had shown her that weapons could be taken away from people who didn't know how to use them properly. And Jake, despite his cruelty and his willingness to hurt others, clearly had no real training with that blade.
"You don't want to do this, Jake," she said quietly, her voice carrying authority that hadn't been there before.
"Put the knife down and walk away, both of you."
This ends now. Marcus was trying to get back to his feet, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side. "Jake, kill this crazy bitch," he managed to say through gritted teeth. "She's completely lost her mind." But Jake was looking at Sarah differently now. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like uncertainty. The girl standing before him bore no resemblance to the frightened victim they had been tormenting for months.
What do you get by the reaction, say you made it?
This person radiated danger in a way that made his primitive brain start screaming warnings.
I said put it down,
Sarah repeated, taking a step forward instead of backing away. The movement was predatory, controlled, like a big cat preparing to strike. "This is your last warning." Jake's nerve broke first. With a wild yell, he charged forward with the knife extended, aiming for her midsection in a clumsy, desperate thrust. Sarah moved like liquid lightning, stepping inside his reach and trapping his knife hand against her body while her free hand struck his wrist with pinpoint accuracy. The knife clattered to the pavement as Jake screamed, cradling what was obviously a broken wrist. But Sarah wasn't finished. Months of harassment, of fear, of sleepless nights and anxiety attacks were pouring out of her in a torrent of controlled violence. Her knee came up to meet Jake's descending face, the impact sending him sprawling backward onto the concrete. The sound his head made when it hit the pavement was sickeningly wet. Marcus had managed to struggle back to his feet, but the fight had gone out of him completely. His face was pale with shock and pain, his dominant arm completely useless. "You're crazy," he whispered, backing away from her with shuffling steps. "You're completely insane." "No," Sarah said calmly, walking toward him with measured steps. "I'm just done being your victim." What happened next would be debated in police reports and witness statements for months to come.
Marcus later claimed that Sarah attacked him without provocation, that she had gone berserk and assaulted him for no reason.
But the security camera footage from the library, grainy and distant though it was, told a different story. It showed two men cornering a smaller woman, showed them surrounding her and clearly threatening her, showed one of them producing a weapon. What the camera couldn't capture was the moment of transformation, the instant when Sarah Chen stopped being prey and became something else entirely. It couldn't show the cold calculation in her eyes as she evaluated Marcus's weaknesses, couldn't record the surgical precision with which she dismantled his ability to hurt her or anyone else. Marcus tried to run, but his injury slowed him down. Sarah caught him easily, her hand grasping the back of his shirt and pulling him off balance. As he turned to face her, stumbling and off balance, her foot swept his legs out from under him. He went down hard, his already dislocated shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. "Please," he gasped, looking up at her with eyes that held genuine fear for the first time in his life. "Please, stop. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything." Sarah stood over him, breathing hard but completely in control. The adrenaline was singing in her veins, making every color more vivid, every sound more clear. She had never felt more alive, more powerful, more completely herself than she did in this moment. "You're sorry," she repeated, her voice carrying no emotion whatsoever.
Oh!
"After months of making my life hell, after threatening me, after pulling a knife on me, now you're sorry." Jake was trying to crawl away, leaving a small trail of blood from his head wound on the concrete. Sarah watched him for a moment, calculating whether he was still a threat. The sight of him, reduced from confident predator to whimpering victim in the span of minutes, filled her with a satisfaction so profound it was almost spiritual. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that brooked no argument. "You're both going to the hospital tonight. You're going to tell him exactly what happened, how you cornered an innocent woman in a parking lot with a weapon and got exactly what you deserved." Marcus tried to shake his head, but the movement made him gasp in pain. "Nobody will believe that," he managed to say. "A little girl like you doesn't do this to guys like us." Sarah smiled then, and it was not a pleasant expression.
Oh, but I did.
And the cameras saw everything. Your choice now is simple. Admit what you did and face the consequences, or lie about it and discover what else I'm capable of. The threat hung in the air between them, and both men seemed to understand that this was not a bluff. Sarah had crossed a line tonight, had discovered something about herself that couldn't be undone. She was no longer the frightened victim who had walked into that parking lot. She was something new, something dangerous, something that neither of them wanted to test further. Campus security arrived 12 minutes later, summoned by a late-night janitor who had heard the commotion. They found Marcus Rodriguez unconscious from pain and shock, his shoulder dislocated and his collarbone fractured. Jake Thompson was semi-conscious with a concussion, a broken wrist, 3 cracked ribs, and what the medical examiner would later describe as extensive facial trauma consistent with being struck by a trained martial artist. They found Sarah Chen sitting on the hood of her car, completely calm and apparently uninjured, waiting for them to arrive.
Her hands were scraped, and her clothes were disheveled, but she showed no signs of the hysteria or shock that typically accompanied violent encounters.
When asked what had happened, her answer was simple and direct. "They cornered me in the parking lot. One of them had a knife. I defended myself." The investigation that followed was thorough but ultimately straightforward. The security footage, despite its limitations, clearly showed the two men approaching Sarah in a threatening manner. The knife was found at the scene with Jake's fingerprints on it. Both men had extensive histories of complaints filed against them for harassment and intimidation, though none had been taken seriously by the administration. Most damning of all was Marcus's own statement to the emergency room physician. Still groggy from pain medication and shock, he had admitted that they had been teaching the stuck-up bitch a lesson when she went crazy and attacked us. By the time his lawyer arrived to advise him to stay silent, the damage was already done. Sarah spent 3 hours at the police station giving her statement, but she was never charged with any crime. The district attorney's office reviewed the case and determined that she had acted in clear self-defense against 2 attackers, one of whom was armed. The fact that her attackers had sustained more serious injuries than she had was irrelevant. The law protected victims who fought back, regardless of how effectively they did so. But the real change wasn't in the legal system or the police reports. It was in Sarah herself. As she drove home that night, her hands steady on the steering wheel for the first time in months, she realized that she had discovered something precious that had been hidden inside her all along. She had found her strength, her power, her refusal to be anyone's victim ever again.
Her phone rang as she pulled into her driveway.
Her father's number appeared on the screen, and she answered it with a voice that sounded different even to her own ears.
"Dad," she said simply.
"Sarah? I just got a call from the college. They said there was an incident. Are you all right?" For the first time in months, Sarah Chen smiled a genuine smile. "Yes, Dad, I'm perfect. I think you'd be proud of me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Tell me what happened, sweetheart." As Sarah recounted the events of the evening, she could hear the change in her father's breathing. When she finished, there was another long silence. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "I am more proud of you than you could possibly imagine. You did exactly what I taught you to do. You stood up for yourself, and you survived." But even as her father spoke words of pride and support, Sarah knew that this was only the beginning. The girl who had walked into that parking lot was gone forever, replaced by someone harder, stronger, and infinitely more dangerous.
And as she hung up the phone and walked into her house, Sarah Chen began to understand that her real education was just beginning.
The news of the parking lot incident spread through the college like wildfire, but the story changed with each telling, until Sarah barely recognized herself in the rumors that swirled around campus. Some students whispered that she had gone completely insane and attacked two innocent classmates without provocation. Others claimed she was secretly a black belt in multiple martial arts who had been hiding her abilities all along. The truth, as usual, was somewhere in between, but Sarah found that she no longer cared what people thought.
What mattered was the way people looked at her now. The fear in their eyes when she walked down the hallway was intoxicating in a way she hadn't expected. For months, she had been invisible except as a target for cruelty.
Now, she was very visible indeed, but as something to be respected rather than victimized. The transformation was as psychological as it was physical.
Marcus and Jake were expelled from the college within a week of the incident. Marcus would require months of physical therapy to regain full use of his shoulder, and Jake's concussion had left him with persistent headaches and memory problems that would affect him for years to come. Neither would press charges, despite their lawyer's advice, because they understood intuitively that Sarah Chen was not someone they wanted to face in a courtroom or anywhere else ever again.
But for Sarah, their departure was only the beginning.
The incident had awakened something in her that had been dormant her entire life, a capacity for violence that was both thrilling and terrifying. She found herself analyzing every person she encountered, automatically identifying their weaknesses and vulnerabilities.
The way someone stood could tell her about old injuries that could be exploited. The way they moved their hands revealed whether they had any real fighting experience. She had become a predator in sheep's clothing, and the transformation was addictive. Her academic performance, which had suffered during the months of harassment, rebounded with a vengeance. But her focus had shifted from theoretical knowledge to practical application. She devoured books on military tactics, psychology of combat, and the history of warfare. She began taking additional martial arts classes at a dojo in town, impressing her instructors with her natural ability and her almost frightening intensity. Sensei Yoshida, a former Japanese special forces operative who had opened the dojo after retiring from active duty, took particular interest in Sarah's development. He recognized something in her that reminded him of himself during his military years, a combination of intelligence, dedication, and carefully controlled violence that marked natural warriors. "You have good technique," he told her, after a particularly intense sparring session where she had systematically dismantled 3 different opponents.
But, more important, you have the mind for this.
You think like a fighter, not like someone playing at fighting. Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead and bowed respectfully to her sensei. "I want to learn everything you can teach me," she said simply, and she did learn everything.
Over the following months, Sarah threw herself into her training with an intensity that bordered on obsession.
She learned Krav Maga from an Israeli instructor who taught her how to disable attackers permanently. She studied boxing with a former professional who showed her how to generate maximum power with minimum telegraphing. She took weapons training courses that taught her how to use anything, from kitchen knives to improvised weapons with lethal efficiency. Her body began to change as well. The soft curves of her college girl figure were replaced by lean muscle and perfectly conditioned reflexes. She could run 5 miles without breathing hard, execute 100 push-ups without strain, and her hands had developed calluses that spoke of countless hours striking heavy bags and wooden posts. But the most dramatic change was in her confidence. The frightened, anxious girl who had cowered before Marcus and Jake was gone completely, replaced by someone who moved through the world with the quiet assurance of a person who knew exactly what they were capable of. Other students began to give her a wide berth, not out of malice, but out of a primitive recognition that she was no longer prey. Her professors noticed the change as well. In criminal justice classes, her insights into criminal psychology became uncannily accurate. She could predict with startling precision how different types of criminals would behave under pressure, what mistakes they would make, and how law enforcement could exploit their weaknesses. Her papers on violent crime and self-defense law became legendary among the faculty for their clinical precision and practical applicability.
Doctor!
Rebecca Martinez, who taught advanced criminal psychology, pulled Sarah aside after one particularly impressive presentation on threat assessment. "Sarah, I have to ask," Dr. Martinez said, settling into her office chair with a concerned expression. "Your recent work has been exceptional, But there's something different about your perspective. It's almost as if you're writing from personal experience with violence. Sarah met her professor's gaze steadily.
"Isn't personal experience the best teacher?" she replied. "You can read about violence in textbooks, but until you've experienced it yourself, until you've been in that situation where your life depends on your ability to act decisively, you don't really understand it."
Dr. Martinez leaned forward in her chair.
Have you been in that situation, Sarah? Yes, Sarah answered without hesitation, and I won. The conversation ended there, but Dr. Martinez would later remember that moment as the first time she realized that one of her students might be genuinely dangerous.
Not dangerous in an unstable or unpredictable way, but dangerous in the way that trained soldiers were dangerous. Controlled, competent, and utterly without illusion about the realities of violence.
Sarah's reputation began to spread beyond the college. The story of the parking lot incident had been picked up by local news outlets, though the details were often exaggerated or completely fabricated. Some versions portrayed her as a helpless victim who got lucky. Others described her as a vigilante who had gone too far. But among people who actually knew about fighting, who understood what it meant to disable two larger opponents simultaneously, her name began to carry a different kind of weight.
Assessors, What?
Local law enforcement took notice as well. Detective Ray Sullivan, a 20-year veteran of the San Diego Police Department, had read the incident report and been impressed by the clinical precision with which Sarah had neutralized her attackers. When he learned that she was studying criminal justice, he reached out to offer her an internship with the department.
"We could use someone with your particular skill set,"
he told her during their initial meeting. Most officers go their entire careers without ever having to use force, but when they do, they need to be able to act decisively and effectively.
You've already proven you can do that under pressure.
Sarah accepted the internship eagerly. Working with real police officers, dealing with actual criminals rather than theoretical case studies, felt like coming home in a way she hadn't expected.
Where is it?
Hey! She excelled at every aspect of the work, from interviewing suspects to analyzing crime scenes. But what really set her apart was her ability to get dangerous people to cooperate without resorting to standard intimidation tactics.
There was something about her presence, a quiet intensity that seemed to communicate to violent criminals that she understood their world in a way that most officers didn't. Hardened gang members who had never cooperated with police found themselves answering her questions.
Career criminals who had built their reputations on intimidating others seemed to recognize that she was not someone who could be intimidated. Detective Sullivan watched her work with growing amazement. "I've never seen anything like it," he told his partner after watching Sarah extract a confession from a murder suspect who had stonewalled 3 other detectives. "It's like she speaks their language." But Sarah knew it was more than that. She didn't just speak the language of violence. She was fluent in it. She understood the psychology of people who used force to get what they wanted because she had tapped into that same capacity within herself. The difference was that she had learned to control it, to channel it constructively rather than destructively. Her success with the police department led to other opportunities. Federal agencies began to take notice of the young woman, who seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to understand and predict violent behavior. She received recruitment calls from the FBI, the DEA, and even some agencies whose names she wasn't allowed to mention publicly. But it was a seemingly routine assignment that would change the course of her life entirely. Detective Sullivan asked her to assist with a case involving threats against a local military base. Someone had been making credible threats against Navy personnel, and the base security wanted civilian law enforcement assistance in tracking down the perpetrator.
Sarah's first visit to Naval Base Coronado was a revelation.
Walking among the SEALs and other special operations personnel, she felt like she had found her tribe. These were people who understood the realities of violence as clearly as she did, who had been trained to the same level of competence that she had achieved through her own efforts. The base commander, Captain James Morrison, was initially skeptical about accepting help from a college intern, regardless of her reputation. But his attitude changed quickly when he saw Sarah work. She analyzed the threat assessment with a precision that impressed even the base intelligence officers, and her psychological profile of the suspect was so accurate that they located him within 48 hours. "Where did you learn to think like this?" Captain Morrison asked her after the successful resolution of the case. "I learned from the best teachers I could find," Sarah replied. "And I learned that sometimes the most important lessons come from the worst experiences." Captain Morrison studied her for a long moment. Would you be interested in continuing to work with us? We have ongoing security concerns that could benefit from your particular expertise. Sarah accepted without hesitation. Working with the SEALs felt like the natural progression of everything she had been working toward. These were people who understood that violence was sometimes necessary, who had been trained to apply it with precision and effectiveness, who shared her recognition that the world was a dangerous place that required dangerous people to protect it. But she had no idea that her real test was still to come. The incident that would make her legend among the special operations community was still months away, waiting for her like destiny. She was about to discover that all of her training, all of her transformation, had been preparing her for a moment when she would face not 2 college bullies, but nearly 300 of the most dangerous men in the world. And she would prove to all of them that they had underestimated her just as completely as Marcus and Jake had. The call came at 3 in the morning, jarring Sarah from a deep sleep filled with dreams of combat scenarios and tactical formations. Captain Morrison's voice was tense with urgency when she answered the phone. "Sarah, I need you at the base immediately. We have a situation that requires your particular expertise." She was dressed and in her car within 10 minutes, driving through the empty San Diego streets. With the kind of focused intensity that had become her trademark, the gate guards waved her through without question. Her security clearance had been expedited weeks earlier after she had successfully prevented what could have been a devastating terrorist attack on the base's ammunition depot.
Captain Morrison met her at the entrance to the main briefing room, his usual composed demeanor showing cracks of stress and frustration.
"Sarah, what I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room under any circumstances. Do you understand?" "Completely," she replied, her mind already shifting into the analytical mode that had made her invaluable to base security. The briefing room was filled with grim-faced officers and intelligence personnel, their expressions uniformly dark. A large screen at the front of the room displayed satellite imagery of a compound somewhere in the Middle Eastern desert, its buildings marked with red indicators that suggested hostile activity. 3 days ago, one of our SEAL teams was captured during a reconnaissance mission in Syria, Captain Morrison began without preamble. Team Bravo, 6 of our best operators, including Lieutenant Commander Alex Stone. Sarah felt her stomach clench with professional concern. She had worked with Stone on several security assessments, and he was widely regarded as one of the most capable SEALs on the base. If he and his team had been captured, the situation was serious indeed. "The captors have made contact," Morrison continued, clicking to the next slide, which showed a photograph of a bearded man in military fatigues. Ahmad Hassan, a former Iraqi Special Forces officer who now runs a mercenary organization. He's holding our people in a fortified compound approximately 200 kilometers east of Damascus. "What are his demands?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "That's where it gets complicated," Morrison replied grimly. "He doesn't want money or prisoner exchanges. Hassan has heard about you, Sarah. Specifically, he's heard about the parking lot incident and your work with our security teams. He's issued a challenge." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face.
What kind of challenge?
Morrison clicked to the next slide, which displayed a typed message in heavily accented English. "He wants to test his best fighters against the American woman who has impressed our special forces so much. His exact words were, 'Send me the little warrior who thinks she can fight like a man, and we will see if American women are as weak as American men.'" The room fell silent as the implications of the message sank in. Sarah stared at the screen, processing the tactical and psychological dimensions of the situation with the cold calculation that had become second nature to her. "How many fighters are we talking about?" she asked finally. "Intelligence estimates between 15 and 20 of Hassan's personal guard," Morrison replied. "All former special forces from various Middle Eastern armies, all combat veterans, all considerably larger than you." Sarah nodded slowly, her mind already working through the possibilities. "What's the alternative if I don't accept?" Morrison's expression grew even more grim. "Hassan executes one team member every 48 hours until either we send you or he gets bored with waiting. He's already sent us a video of Lieutenant Commander Stone being tortured to prove he's serious." The tactical situation was clear, and Sarah understood why Morrison had called her. A direct military assault on Hassan's compound would likely result in the execution of all the hostages before rescue forces could reach them. Negotiation was pointless with someone who had already made his demands so specific. The only option was to give Hassan exactly what he wanted and hope that she could somehow survive long enough for extraction. "What's the extraction plan?" she asked, accepting the mission before Morrison had even formally offered it to her. "There isn't one yet," Morrison admitted. Hassan wants you to come alone, unarmed, as a demonstration of American confidence in your abilities. Once you've completed his challenge, he says he'll release our people and allow you to leave. Sarah almost laughed at the naivety of that statement.
Captain, with respect, we both know that Hassan has no intention of letting me leave alive regardless of what happens. This is a suicide mission disguised as a prisoner exchange.
Morrison leaned forward in his chair, his eyes reflecting the weight of command decisions that had no good options.
Sarah, I can't order you to do this.
You're not military personnel, and even if you were, I couldn't order anyone to walk into what amounts to an execution. But those 6 men have families, careers, futures, and you're the only person Hassan is willing to negotiate with. The room remained silent while Sarah considered her options. She could refuse the mission and live with the knowledge that 6 SEALs would die because she wasn't willing to risk her own life. She could accept the mission knowing that her chances of survival were minimal at best. Or she could find a third option that nobody in the room had considered yet. I need complete tactical intelligence on Hassan's compound, she said finally. Satellite imagery, building layouts, guard rotations, everything you have.
I also need to know exactly what Hassan's background is, what kind of fighter he was before he became a mercenary leader. Morrison gestured to one of the intelligence officers, who began pulling up detailed files on the target location.
Sarah, even with perfect intelligence, the odds are completely against you. 15 to 20 experienced fighters, all larger and stronger than you, on their home ground with weapons while you'll be unarmed.
Sarah studied the satellite imagery with the same intensity she had once devoted to criminal case files. The compound was well fortified but not impregnable.
The buildings were arranged in a defensive pattern that would make outside assault difficult, but which also created choke points and kill zones that could be exploited by someone fighting from the inside. Captain, what if the mission parameters weren't exactly what Hassan expects? She asked, her mind beginning to formulate a plan that was so audacious it bordered on insanity. What do you mean? Sarah pointed to a section of the satellite image that showed what appeared to be a training area surrounded by barracks buildings.
Hassan wants to test his fighters against me.
He's expecting the terrified American girl who got lucky against 2 college students. He's not expecting someone who's been trained by the best instructors you could provide, someone who understands tactical combat at the same level as his special forces background. Morrison was beginning to understand her line of thinking. You want to turn his challenge into an actual test of military capability.
Exactly!
Hassan is a warrior from a warrior culture. He respects strength and despises weakness.
If I can prove that I'm not just lucky but genuinely skilled, if I can defeat his fighters using superior technique rather than surprise, he might actually honor his word about releasing the hostages.
Those pass into the head of the Texas absent down and tell.
One of the intelligence officers looked up from his computer terminal. Ma'am, I've been analyzing Hassan's psychological profile.
He's never been defeated in personal combat, and his reputation among his followers is built largely on his fighting ability.
If you could somehow manage to defeat him personally, it might undermine his authority enough to create an opportunity for extraction. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with understanding a combat situation completely. How long do I have to prepare? Morrison checked his watch. Hassan wants an answer within 12 hours and your arrival within 72 hours if you accept. That gives us 3 days to get you ready for what might be the most dangerous mission any American has ever undertaken, voluntarily. Sarah stood up from the briefing table, her mind already shifting into the focused state that preceded intense training. Then we'd better get started. I'm going to need access to every combat instructor on this base, every piece of training equipment you have, and every tactical manual in your library.
Sarah, Morrison said quietly, you understand that even if everything goes perfectly according to your plan, you're still talking about fighting your way through 20 Special Forces veterans and then somehow escaping from a fortified compound in hostile territory. She turned back to face him, and Morrison later said that he saw something in her eyes that reminded him of the most dangerous operators he had ever known.
Captain, those men trusted their government to bring them home safely. I'm not going to let them down because I was afraid to take risks.
Over the next 72 hours, Sarah underwent the most intensive combat training of her life. She worked with Army Rangers on close-quarters combat, with Marine instructors on hand-to-hand fighting techniques, and with SEAL trainers on escape and evasion tactics.
She learned to fight with improvised weapons, to disable multiple attackers simultaneously, and to function effectively while exhausted, injured, and outnumbered. But more importantly, she learned to think like a special forces operator rather than a self-defense student. Her instructors taught her to see the battlefield as a three-dimensional puzzle, where every element could be used tactically, where every advantage had to be created rather than assumed, where survival depended on being faster, smarter, and more ruthless than anyone expected.
On the morning of her departure, Captain Morrison walked with her to the helicopter that would begin her journey to Syria.
Sarah, I want you to know that regardless of what happens over there, you've already proven yourself to every operator on this base.
You don't have anything left to prove to anyone.
Sarah shouldered her gear bag, which contained nothing more than basic survival equipment and a change of clothes. Hassan's terms had been explicit. She was to arrive unarmed and alone, trusting in his word as a warrior that the challenge would be conducted fairly.
Captain, she said, shaking his hand with a grip that demonstrated the calluses and strength she had developed over months of intense training. I'm not going over there to prove anything to Hassan or his fighters. I'm going because 6 Americans are counting on me to bring them home.
As the helicopter lifted off from Naval Base Coronado, Sarah looked down at the base where she had found her true calling. In a few hours, she would be walking into a situation that would test every skill she had learned, every technique she had mastered, and every ounce of courage she possessed. She was about to discover that all of her training had been leading to this moment, when she would face not just 20 fighters, but nearly 300 spectators who had come to watch the American woman be humiliated and destroyed.
None of them had any idea what they were actually about to witness. The Syrian desert stretched endlessly in all directions as Sarah's helicopter approached Hassan's compound, the morning sun turning the sand into a shimmering sea of gold and amber.
Through the aircraft's window, she could see the fortress-like structure rising from the desert floor like something out of an ancient warrior's nightmare. High walls surrounded a complex of buildings that could house several hundred fighters, with guard towers positioned at strategic intervals to provide overlapping fields of fire. As the helicopter settled onto a makeshift landing pad outside the compound's main gate, Sarah could see dozens of armed men emerging from buildings and defensive positions to witness her arrival. Word had apparently spread throughout Hassan's organization that the American woman was coming to face their leader's challenge, and no one wanted to miss the spectacle of her inevitable defeat. Hassan himself was waiting at the gate, flanked by 6 of his largest and most intimidating fighters. He was exactly what Sarah had expected from his intelligence file. Tall, powerfully built, with the kind of scars that spoke of decades of combat experience. His eyes held the flat, predatory intelligence of someone who had killed many people and felt no particular emotion about it.
"So," he said in accented but perfectly clear English, as Sarah stepped down from the helicopter, "the famous American warrior woman arrives at last."
"You are much smaller than I expected." Sarah met his gaze without flinching, drawing on every technique she had learned for projecting confidence in threatening situations. Size isn't everything, Hassan. I thought a former Special Forces officer would understand that. Hassan laughed, a sound that held no warmth or humor.
"We will see, little woman."
We will see very soon whether American training produces warriors or merely arrogant children.
As they walked through the compound's gate, Sarah assessed her surroundings with the tactical awareness that had become second nature.
The layout was exactly as the satellite imagery had suggested, but being inside the walls gave her a much better sense of the distances and angles she would need to work with. More importantly, she could see the faces of Hassan's followers as they gathered to watch the proceedings. These were not the undisciplined thugs she had expected, but genuine veterans who moved with the confidence and awareness of professional soldiers. Many bore the scars and bearing of men who had survived serious combat, and all of them radiated the kind of casual violence that came from years of fighting for survival in one of the world's most dangerous regions. "Before we begin," Hassan said as they approached what appeared to be a large training area surrounded by concrete bleachers, "I want you to see why you are here." He gestured to a group of guards who led 6 men in American military uniforms onto the platform. Sarah's heart clenched as she recognized Lieutenant Commander Stone and his team.
All of whom showed signs of rough treatment but appeared to be alive and relatively intact.
"Your countrymen are brave fighters," Hassan acknowledged with what seemed like genuine respect. "They have endured their captivity with honor."
"But their fate now depends entirely on your performance in the next few hours." Sarah looked at Stone, who met her eyes with a slight nod that conveyed both gratitude and understanding.
So, there's no way yet to show you whether our enduring powers are together.
He knew, as she did, that this was likely a one-way mission for all of them. But he also knew that she represented their only chance of survival, however slim that chance might be. "What exactly are the rules of this challenge?" Sarah asked, turning her attention back to Hassan.
Simple, he replied, gesturing toward the training area where armed guards were now positioning themselves around the perimeter. You will face my fighters, one at a time, until you can no longer continue.
Each time you defeat one of my men, we will release one of your countrymen. When you fall, which you inevitably will, the remaining Americans will be executed. Sarah nodded slowly, accepting the terms while calculating the tactical implications. Fighting 20 opponents consecutively, even one at a time, would require her to end each encounter quickly to conserve energy. More importantly, she would need to demoralize Hassan's forces by winning in such a decisive manner that they began to doubt their leader's judgment. One more thing, Hassan added with a cruel smile. Each of my fighters you will face is armed with traditional weapons of our region. You, of course, will fight with your bare hands, as befits your status as a prisoner. The crowd of spectators had grown to nearly 300 men, all of them eager to watch the American woman be humiliated and destroyed. They filled the bleachers and stood along the walls, creating an amphitheater of hostility that would have been intimidating to anyone who hadn't learned to channel fear into tactical advantage. Are you ready, little warrior? Hassan asked mockingly.
Sarah walked to the center of the fighting area, her movements calm and purposeful despite the adrenaline coursing through her system.
She could feel the weight of hundreds of hostile eyes upon her, could hear the murmurs of men placing bets on how quickly she would be defeated.
I'm ready,
she said simply. Hassan raised his hand to signal the beginning of the challenge, and the crowd fell silent with anticipation. The first fighter who entered the ring was a giant of a man, easily 6.5 feet tall and weighing probably 250 pounds. He carried a curved sword that gleamed wickedly in the desert sun, and moved with the fluid grace of someone who had been trained from childhood in its use. The crowd erupted in cheers and jeers as the fighter approached Sarah with confident strides. This was exactly what they had come to see. Their champion destroying the arrogant American woman who had dared to challenge their leader's judgment.
But Sarah was no longer the frightened college student who had once cowered before bullies in a parking lot.
She was a weapon that had been forged in the fires of humiliation and tempered through months of the most intensive training available anywhere in the world. As the swordsman raised his weapon for the killing blow he was certain would end the fight immediately, Sarah moved. What happened next would be discussed in military circles for years to come. Sarah didn't try to avoid the sword stroke or defend against it. Instead, she moved inside the fighter's reach with liquid speed, her hands finding the nerve clusters that her military instructors had taught her to target. The giant warrior's sword arm went numb instantly, the weapon falling from nerveless fingers as Sarah's elbow drove into his solar plexus with devastating force. As he doubled over, gasping for air, Sarah's knee met his descending face with surgical precision. The sound of breaking bone echoed across the suddenly silent compound as the fighter collapsed unconscious at her feet, defeated in less than 10 seconds by an opponent he outweighed by more than 100 pounds. The crowd's cheers died instantly, replaced by stunned silence. This was not what anyone had expected to see. The American woman was supposed to be helpless, terrified, easily overwhelmed by superior strength and weapons, but the person standing calmly over their defeated champion bore no resemblance to their expectations.